In this section, we're going to start walking through the setup of Flutter on macOS. So if you are running Windows, then skip this video, continue on to the next section where you'll see some videos on setting up Flutter on a Windows machine. All right, so if you're still here, I'm going to assume that you are on macOS and you're ready to go through this setup. On the screen right here, I've got a diagram of exactly how we're going to go about this. We're going to first install a tool called the Flutter CLI, which is what we use to generate new Flutter apps and actually run them for testing purposes on our own laptop. Once we go through that initial setup process, we'll then do some setup for either Android or iOS. Now, between Android and iOS, if you're running macOS, you can install the set, or you can go through the setup for either of these or both of them if you want to. Throughout the entire course, you're going to see me mostly making use of the Android emulator for testing out all of our applications. There's not necessarily any good reason for that. I could have just as well done the rest of this course all with iOS if I had chosen to. Okay, so let's get to it. We're going to first begin by installing the Flutter CLI. We're going to navigate to the Flutter homepage at flutter.io inside of our browser. So I'm going to pull that up right now, flutter.io. And then once here, I'm going to find the blue Get Started button on this page. I then get prompted to go through the installation process. And of course, we're going to go through the installation on Mac OS. All right, so this is where things start getting interesting. You're going to see that there are a tremendous number of steps to go through to do this entire setup. And unfortunately, it's kind of accurate. We do have to do a pretty hefty amount of startup. Now I'm going to begin by first scrolling it down a little bit. And I'm going to find the section marked as Get the Flutter SDK. And inside this section, you'll see a link to a zip file that you can download. So I'm going to click this to start the download process. Now, this is a rather large file, so we're going to pause the video right here. We're going to come back in the next section and start making use of this zip file. In the last section, we downloaded the Flutter SDK, and we're now ready to extract it onto our local machine. So here's the process of what we're going to do. We just did the download. We're now going to take that zip file and we're going to move it to a workspace directory on our local machine. Now, when I say workspace right here, I don't mean to say that this is going to be a folder that has to be called workspace. It could be called my code or my projects or whatever you want it to be. It's just some folder on your local machine where you normally store code. So I personally call it workspace, because that's what I call the folder where I store all the different projects that I'm working on at any given time. But again, it does not have to be called workspace. Once we move that zip file over, we're then going to extract the zip, and then we're going to do a little bit of setup for something called our path variable to make sure that it includes that new directory that we are creating. So let's move on to the second step right here. I'm going to pull open the download directory. So here's my downloads folder. I've got the zip file that we just downloaded right here. And then I have a second Finder window open. Again, this is open up to my workspace directory, or just whatever location you have on your local computer that you use to store code. I'm going to take the zip file, I'm going to move it over to this workspace directory, and then I can double-click the zip file to extract the contents into this directory. Now, doing that extraction process takes a minute or two. So for the sake of time, I actually already went ahead and did it. So after you do that extraction, you should see a new folder inside of whatever your workspace directory is called simply Flutter. If you open this up, you'll see a collection of different files and folders inside there. And so this is everything that we need to generate and run new Flutter projects. And we're not done just yet. We still have to do a little bit more setup for our path variable. So let's take a quick break right here, come back to the next section, and we'll continue with that setup. In the last section, we finished up downloading the Flutter SDK, and then we extracted it into a workspace directory. We're now going to do a little bit of setup on our local path variable to make sure that our terminal watches that Flutter directory. So this last step right here is a little bit complicated, so let's take a look at a quick diagram to explain exactly what we're going to do. Okay, so at some point in time in the very near future, you and I are going to want to use that Flutter SDK that we just extracted from our terminal. We're going to use that SDK to generate new Flutter projects and run projects that we have created. So inside of our terminal, at some point in time, you and I are going to want to run this Flutter command. However, if you open up your terminal right now and try to run the command Flutter, you'll probably see something like this, something that says command not found. So even though we have installed the SDK or extracted it onto our local machine, there is nothing that has actually wired up that Flutter tool to our terminal. And so that's what we have to do right now. Now, to wire up Flutter to our terminal, we're going to make a little change to something called the path variable. The path variable is what your terminal uses whenever it tries to interpret a command that you execute. So when you and I run a command like Flutter right here, your terminal is going to look at a variable inside of it, the terminal, called path. That path variable stores references to a couple of different directories on your local machine. If you want to see the different directories that are referenced by path, you can go over to your terminal right now and write out echo path. So inside this long string, you'll see that there's a couple of different folder references, all separated by colons. And so what this means right here is that if I run the command flutter right now, terminal is going to look at that path variable. It's going to look at all the different directories that it references. So for me, I have user local bin, user bin, bin, user sbin. So my terminal is going to look into each of those directories, and in each of them, it's going to try to find a program called Flutter that it can execute. But of course, right now, none of those directories have a Flutter program inside them. The actual Flutter program that we want to run is inside that Flutter directory that we just created, nested inside of a subdirectory called bin. As a matter of fact, if I go back over to my Finder window right now, here's the Flutter directory that was just created. Here's the bin directory, and inside there is a program called Flutter. So this right here is the program that we want our terminal to run. So that's what we're doing right now. We need to make sure that this path variable tries to look at that bin directory anytime that we run a program at the terminal. So to do so, I'm going to open up my terminal window, and I'm first going to navigate to that Flutter directory that we just created. So for me, that's inside of my workspace directory. Inside there is the Flutter directory that was just created. I'm going to change into there. I'll print out all the files and folders inside that Flutter directory, and then I'm going to change into that bin folder that we just spoke about. So now that I'm inside of bin, I could print out everything inside of here, and right there, that is the Flutter program that you and I want to attempt to execute. So we want to essentially add this current bin directory to our path variable. The first thing we're going to do is print out the path to this folder that we are currently looking at. I could print out the entire path to it by writing out pwd, which stands for present working directory. When I run that command, it'll print out the entire path to get to this current folder. So again, for me, I see workspace inside of here because that is the kind of working directory that I use for all of my projects. But you might have something totally different on your local machine, depending upon where you extracted that Flutter zip file. So I'm now going to highlight this entire path, and I'm going to copy it. I'm now going to open up a second terminal window, and inside this new terminal window, we're going to attempt to modify that path variable. I'm going to first begin by changing back to my home directory by writing cd // and then I'm going to print out all the files and folders inside of this home directory by running the command ls-a. Now the -a switch on there, like ls-a, the -a part is going to make sure that I print out all the hidden files and folders inside of here as well. And so if I scroll up a little bit, one of the hidden files inside of here is the .bash profile. So this is the file that we're going to use to manipulate our path variable. If you do not have a .bash profile file inside of here, you can create that file by running the command touch.bash profile like so. But again, you only have to do that if you do not have that directory or that file listed. Okay, so I'm now going to open up that file and attempt to edit it. So I'm going to run the command nano.bash profile. And that's going to open up a command line text editor. Inside of here, you'll notice that my bash profile is currently empty. You might have some amount of code inside of here already, which is totally fine. We are not going to change anything inside of here. We are going to make only one addition to this file. And so anywhere inside of here, we're going to write out the command export, then we're going to say path equals, and then we're going to paste in that long directory that we just copied a second ago that takes us all the way to that bin folder. So I'm going to say export path equals, and I'm going to paste in that big long path. And again, yours is probably going to look slightly different than mine if you call your working directory anything besides workspace. Now, after I print out that entire directory, I'm then going to put a colon at the very end and put $path, like so. Once I've got this all put together, I'm going to save the file by hitting Control X. You'll see that down here it's asking if I want to save the changes that I just made, and I'm going to say yes. And that's going to ask me for the file name I want to write, and I'll just hit enter, like so. Okay, so that's it. Now to test this out, I'm going to entirely close my terminal window. So I'm going to hit Command Q, and then I'm going to open Terminal Backup. Now with the terminal back up, I can now test out and make sure that I've correctly wired up that Flutter command by simply running Flutter, like so. And once I do so, you'll notice that you should see something like this right here pop up. So if you don't see something like this pop up, if you see something that says command not recognized, that means that something just went wrong when you were setting up your path variable. I encourage you to start this section over again and rewatch it and make sure that you copy paste all those directories appropriately. Okay, so that's it. Let's take a quick break right here. We'll continue in the next section where we're going to start doing some emulator setup on our local machine. In the last section, we finished setting up the Flutter SDK. Now at my terminal, I can run the command Flutter. But when I do so, you'll notice that I see this message right here that says that I need to agree to the Xcode iOS license. And after that, I see a message right here that says Flutter has exited unexpectedly. So if you do not see this message right here, that is totally fine. You can skip this video and continue into the next one. If you do see this message, then to fix it, all you have to do is run the command that it's asking you to run, which is sudo xcode build -license. So I'm going to run the command sudo xcode build -license, like so. I'm going to execute that. I get prompted for my password, which I will enter. I then see right here, hey, you got to agree to the license. Okay, whatever. I'll hit enter to view it, and then I'll hit Q to quit from the license. And then it asks me to agree to that agreement. And of course, my hands are tied, so I'm going to agree to it. Okay, so that's it. I should now be able to run the Flutter command again, and that error message is going to go away. I'm going to see something right here of building Flutter tool, and then over a little bit of time, you're going to see a little bit of other output scroll out here. So we're just going to wait for that to complete, and then we'll continue in the next section. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute. We've now got the Flutter command up and running on our local machine, so we can now use it to generate a new project that we're going to start working on very shortly. To do so, I'm going to change into a workspace directory. So again, for me, this is a folder that I call workspace, but for you, it's going to be wherever you stash code on your local machine. Once I move over to this workspace directory, I'm then going to generate a new project by running the command flutter create, and then we'll put in the name of the project. And for us, the name of this first project that we're going to work on is called Pix, like so. So I'll run that command, and then Flutter is going to automatically generate a ton of different files for us and start installing a couple dependencies as well. After it's all done, you might see a couple of error messages on here. So this is a couple of error messages saying something about whether or not you have an appropriate emulator installed on your local system to actually run and test this application, which is something that you and I have not done just yet. So we've now got our workspace directory put together. We've got a new Pix folder inside there, which is housing that new project that we just created. Let's take a quick break. We'll continue in the next section, and we're going to start to set up our Android and iOS emulators. In the last section, we used the Flutter command line tool to generate a new project directory called Pix. So this is going to be the first application that we're going to work on, and we're going to come back to that folder in just a little bit. First, however, we're going to spend a little bit of time to set up both the Android emulator and the iOS simulator on our local machines. Now, just to be clear, you do not have to set up both Android and iOS on your local machine. You have to do at least one of them, but you don't have to do both. In this section in particular, we're going to walk through the process of setting up Android on a macOS machine. So if you don't want to go through the Android setup, totally fine. Pause the video right now and skip on to the next one, or next one or two for that matter, where we're going to go through the process of setting up macOS with the iOS simulator. Okay, so if you're still here, we'll start the Android setup. I'm going to again open up my web browser and navigate to the Getting Started guide at flutter.io. Once over here, I'll find the the section labeled Android Setup. I'm going to click on that, and then step one is to install Android Studio. So I'm going to follow the link that is presented right here. Here's Android Studio. We're going to download Android Studio. Now, this is a rather large file, so go ahead and start that download. Once you have successfully downloaded the file, which I've already done right here, all you have to do to install this is double-click that DMG. You'll see this window appear. You're going to take Android Studio right here, and you're just going to drag it over into Applications, like so. So make sure you go through that process. When we come back together in the next section, I'm going to assume that you've already successfully downloaded that file and dragged that icon over to the Applications folder. So quick pause, we'll come back to the next section, and we'll continue with the setup of Android Studio. In the last section, we downloaded Android Studio. We then extracted that and installed it into our Applications directory on our local machine. We're now going to open up Android Studio and use it to create a new emulator, which we're going to use to execute our Flutter code. So to open up Android Studio, I'm going to open up my Finder window. I'll find the Applications directory, and then I can simply double-click on Android Studio right here. And the first time that you set it up, or the first time you open Android Studio, it might ask you if you want to import any settings. You can just say, no, I don't want to import anything. After you get past that window, you'll see a welcome screen like this right here. So we're just going to get through this wizard as quickly as we can. I'm going to click on Next. I'll select Standard. I'll hit Next. We'll then be presented with a couple of different things that need to be downloaded right here. And so these are all tools that are going to be automatically downloaded and installed, and they are all required to successfully run Flutter applications on your local machine. So I'll click on Finish, and then we'll see these kind of download process occur. Now this is going to be a rather large number of files, so we're going to take another break right here, and we'll continue in the next section when all that download stuff is complete. In the last section, we downloaded a couple of different Android dependencies and had them all automatically installed. And so you should now see a Finish button down right here at the right-hand side that is clickable. So I'm going to click on that, and then I get asked if I want to create a new project. So we do want to create a new project. We're not going to actually use Android Studio for anything besides running the emulator, but to create an emulator, we have to create a new project. So I'm going to click on Start a New Project, and then I'll just click Next, 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 and then Finish, like so. Okay, so that's going to create a new project file for us to work from. Again, we don't really care about the project that's being created. We just want to get to the main Android Studio window, which is what we're going to use to create our new simulator. So after a minute or two of setup, hopefully it's not going to take too long here. All right, come on, just a little bit longer. Oh, I'm so sorry, this is taking forever, but I can't stop now. All right, I'll tell you what, we'll pause the video right now and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we generated a new Android project. I apologize for that delay at the end, but I wanted to make sure that we actually saw this window appear right here. So hopefully now you now see something that says Tip of the Day. I'm just going to dismiss that window. And then it's going to take a little bit of time for us to actually be able to create a new emulator. I want you to look down here at the bottom, and it looks like it's actually kind of doing a little bit of work before we can actually do anything with this project. So you can click on the message right here that might say something like Gradle sync failed, and you'll see a message that says install build tools 2703, or you might see a slightly different version down here, which is totally fine if you do. So we're going to click on that link to install those build tools. We're going to be prompted to install some other stuff yet again. I'm going to click on accept, next, and it's going to do a little bit more of downloading and installing. So this step right here is really not documented inside of the Flutter installation document setup directions over here. So this is the part that's just a little bit annoying because they're not really telling you exactly what to do. Okay, so back over inside of Android Studio, I'll click on Finish, and then I'll see a little bit of rebuild going on. It's going to download a couple more dependencies, and then after a second or two, hopefully it's going to resolve. So just to make sure that you don't have to wait again, I'm going to do another quick break, and I'll come back to the next section when this is all complete. In the last section, we finally finished up all of our setup of Android Studio, and we're now going to use it to generate a new emulator, which we're going to use to execute our Flutter application. To do so, I'm going to first go up to the Tools menu up here, and I'll find AVD Manager. I'm going to click on that, and that presents me with a wizard that we're going to use to create our emulator. I'm going to click on Create Virtual Device. We then get prompted to select the device type that we want to simulate. I'm going to use a Nexus 5X right here. You can use any device that you wish. I would recommend, however, that you try to get a screen size around 5 inches or so. I'll then click on Next, and I am asked to select a system image. So this is the version of Android that we're going to install on this emulator. Now I'm going to use the latest version that is listed on here, API 28. Next to API 28, or whatever your latest version is, you'll see a little blue download link. And so you're going to click that link, and it's going to start the download process to get that particular image. The image itself is several gigabytes large, so I encourage you to pause the video right here and allow that download to complete. Okay, so if you're back here, I'm going to assume the download is all finished. We're now going to select API 28 and then click on Next and then Finish. And that's going to then generate our new emulator, and we'll see it immediately start up. Now it takes just a second for this screen to go away as it does all its stuff, so I'm going to give it just a moment or two to finish up. There we go. So now finally on the right hand column over here, you'll see Actions, and we're going to click on that play button. And there's our emulator. Very good. Okay, so this is going to take just a minute to actually start up. So let's take a quick pause, and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we finally started up our emulator, and we're now ready to test out our Flutter application that we just generated on it. The first thing we are going to do is open up our terminal window. Inside of here, I'm going to run flutter doctor --android licenses, like so. And so that entire line is right there. And so these are another couple of licenses that we need to make sure that we accept. I'll hit enter to run that. Now, in particular, I've already installed and ran all these licenses, so it's not going to tell me to do anything, but you're going to see some progress bars, and then it's going to prompt you to just hit enter, enter, enter. So you'll go through a couple screens and eventually get dumped back at your terminal, like so. So now back at my terminal window, I'm going to navigate to the Pix project directory that we had just created. So I'm going to change into my workspace directory. Again, for you, it'll be wherever you stashed all your code. And then inside of here, I'll change into that Pix folder, like so. So now inside of here, to start up our project and run it on the Android emulator, we're going to run the command flutter run, like so. So after doing that, we'll see a little bit of warm up here. And then you'll see a little bit of launching stuff. This is going to take about 30 seconds or so we'll take just a quick pause, and I'll come back to the next section once everything has started up. In the last section, we executed the flutter run command, and I now see the application appearing on the screen of my emulator. So that's pretty much it for Android setup. Now again, if you want to also go through the iOS setup on macOS, then continue in the next section. Otherwise, you can skip over all the rest of the setup stuff and move on to the first application. So, quick break, and we'll continue in just a moment. In this section, we're going to walk through the process of setting up an iOS emulator on a macOS machine. And so if you've already gone through the Android setup for macOS and you don't want to set up iOS, totally fine. Continue on to the application section. That's a couple of videos ahead. Otherwise, stick around and we'll start setting up the iOS emulator on macOS. All right, let's get to it. So the first thing we need to do is install Xcode, which is what we're going to use to generate the emulator that we're going to use. I'll first begin by opening up the App Store program. Inside of the App Store, I'm going to find the search bar up here at the top right-hand side, and I'll search for Xcode. Now Xcode is probably going to be the first option you see on here, and you'll see a green button right underneath it that says Git. So you'll want to go ahead and click that and install Xcode. If you see an update button, like what I have right here, then I highly encourage you to update Xcode as well. Now the Xcode installation process takes a pretty good amount of time, so start up that download, and we'll stop right here and continue in the next section when your download is complete. In the last section, we installed Xcode onto our local machine. I'm now going to close out of my App Store, and I'm going to open up Xcode by hitting Command Space, and I can just type in Xcode like so. The first time we run Xcode, we're going to get a little pop-up that asks if we want to install some additional components, and we definitely do. So I'm going to click on the Install button right here. I then get prompted for my password, which I'll enter, and then it'll go through that installation process. Now doing this install takes a minute or two, so let's take another quick pause right here, and we'll continue in the next section. In the last section, we did a little bit more configuration of Xcode by starting it up and installing a couple more dependencies. I'm now at this welcome screen right here, and I'm going to go up to Xcode at the top. I'll then find Open Developer Tools, and I'll click on Simulator right here. So this is going to start up my local iOS simulator. And in just a second or two, I'll see the window appear. There we go. So that's the device that our application is going to run inside of. I can now go back over to the Xcode window back over here, and I can quit out of Xcode if I want to. Now it's going to take just a second for the iOS simulator to start up here. So I'm going to take another short break. Oh, never mind. We're good to go. So now to actually start up our application inside the simulator, I'm going to open up my terminal window right here. I'm going to navigate to the Pix directory. Remember, that's the folder of the project that we just generated by using the Flutter command line tools. And then inside there, I'm going to run the command flutter devices, like so. When I run that command, it'll print out all the different devices that Flutter thinks is currently running on my local machine. And so right here, you can see that it thinks that I'm running an iPhone X simulator, which I definitely am. So now to start up my application on there, I'll execute flutter run, again, while inside of my Pix project directory. So this is going to start up a compilation process that's going to take that generated project that we just created and deploy it to this local Xcode simulator. Now the startup process takes just a moment or two, so we will take a break this time. We'll come back to the next section and just make sure that everything's started up as we expect. In the last section, we executed the flutter run command while inside of our Pix project directory. Flutter did a little bit of compilation and then eventually deployed our starter application right here to the mobile device. So we now see the default application here on the screen. And that's pretty much it. We're good to go. So let's take a pause right here and continue in the next section.